The veil of the first Duchess was lifted, and a gasp echoed through the grand cathedral. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated scandal. "I am Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood, and the woman standing before me at the altar was not my betrothed. It was not the radiant Seraphina Thorne, the diamond of the season whose hand I had agreed to take. Before me stood her younger sister, Lady Ilara, the quiet one, the shadow who lived in the margins of every ballroom and conversation. 1,000 whispers erupted like crackling fire. I could feel the eyes of the entire aristocracy upon me, the judgment, the pity, the morbid curiosity. My future father-in-law, Lord Thorne, grasped my arm, his hand trembling. His face was a mask of desperate sweat. "A sudden illness, Your Grace," he stammered, his voice a pathetic hiss. "A terrible fever. Seraphina is indisposed. Ilara is here to honor the contract, to save our name." But his words were a lie. I could see it in the frantic shifting of his eyes, and I could see the truth was far more complex in the woman before me. Ilara's face was pale, but her eyes held no panic, no shame. They were steady, intelligent, and fixed on mine with a chilling stillness. She was not a weeping victim dragged to the altar. She was a statement. And as I stood there, with the honor of my house on the line and my world tilting on its axis, I knew this was no simple family crisis. This was a coup. The only question was, who had just seized power? Standing at the altar with the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on me, I realized something far more unsettling than deception. This had not happened suddenly. It had been unfolding in front of me, piece by piece, and I had chosen not to see it. 3 months earlier, at our engagement ball, Seraphina had been flawless. Too flawless. She moved through the ballroom like a performance, laughing at precisely the right moments, accepting admiration as if it were her due, never once faltering under scrutiny. At the time, I had admired it. Now, I recognized it as control. Because perfection, in my world, is never natural. It is constructed, and construction always hides something beneath it. I remember the exact moment the illusion shifted. Ilara passed behind her sister, carrying a tray of crystal glasses. A simple task, a forgettable movement, except Seraphina noticed. "Careful, dear," she said, her voice light, but not soft. "We would not want accidents. Some things, once stained, cannot be restored." It was said for others to hear, a warning disguised as concern. The nearby guests laughed politely, but Ilara did not. She paused, only for a second, and lifted her gaze, not to her sister, to me. It was not embarrassment, it was not submission, it was awareness, as if she were measuring whether I understood what had just happened. I did not. I simply looked away. That was my first mistake. The second came weeks later, at a dinner hosted by Lord Thorne. He spoke at length about honor, about legacy, about the strength of alliances between great houses. But he did not look at me when he spoke. He looked at the table, at his wine, at anything but the man whose name he was about to bind to his own. His voice carried confidence. His eyes did not. And across the table I saw it, the smallest exchange. Lord Harrington leaning slightly toward his wife. A glance, brief, sharp, knowing. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. But in aristocratic society, that is all it takes to communicate ruin. I should have questioned it. I did not. Because Seraphina smiled, and her smile had been designed to prevent questions. Ilara, however, did not smile. She sat at the far end of the table, silent, untouched by the performance unfolding around her, watching, not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as someone waiting for something inevitable to occur. That was my second mistake. I noticed her, and chose to dismiss her. The final moment came in the gardens, a quiet afternoon, no audience, no performance required. Or so I believed. Seraphina walked beside me, discussing arrangements for the estate, her tone warm, agreeable, perfectly aligned with what a future duchess should be. but her attention was elsewhere. I followed her gaze and found him, the Marquis of Vale, leaning casually against a marble column, as if the entire world existed for his amusement. Their eyes met, only for a moment, but it was enough. It was not curiosity, it was not politeness, it was recognition, and something far more dangerous, expectation. From the corner of the garden, beneath the shade of a willow, Ilara was seated with a book. She did not move. She did not interrupt. She simply looked up, and again her eyes found mine, not surprised, not confused, certain, as if she had already seen the outcome of a game I had only just realized was being played. That was the moment I should have understood everything. Instead, I chose the easier truth, that nothing was wrong, that everything was as it appeared, that the woman I was about to marry was exactly who she presented herself to be, and that the quiet sister watching from the margins was irrelevant. Standing now before the altar, facing the wrong bride with the right composure, I understood the reality I had ignored. Serafina had been performing. Her father had been concealing. The Marquise had been waiting, and Ilara had been preparing. The only question that remained was not why this had happened, but how long she had known that it would. I did not celebrate my wedding. I studied it. Every word spoken to me sounded rehearsed. Every smile lingered a second too long. Every congratulations carried the quiet weight of something unspoken. This was not confusion, this was containment, and I intended to find what exactly was being contained. Lord Thorne approached me before the first course had even been cleared, his relief too immediate, too visible. "Your Grace," he said, clasping my hand as if I had rescued him from drowning. "You have done more than honor our agreement. You have preserved our family." Preserved, not joined, not strengthened. Preserved. I held his gaze. "Then I trust your daughter's condition is improving." He faltered, only for a fraction of a second, but long enough. Yes, of course, the fever was severe, but our physician is confident she will recover fully." "Good," I replied calmly. "I will send Dr. Alcroft to attend her personally. I would not have any uncertainty attached to my household." There it was, panic, sharp, immediate, uncontrolled. "No," he said too quickly, then forced a smile. "That will not be necessary. We have everything under control." Of course he did. Men who lie always believe control is something they can declare. I inclined my head slightly, as if satisfied. I was not. Because by the time the orchestra resumed, I already knew one thing with certainty. There was no illness. And if there was no illness, then the woman I had married was not an accident. She was a solution. The question was whose? I found my answer sooner than expected. When we arrived at Blackwood Manor, my staff stood assembled in the grand hall, prepared to receive the Duchess they had been instructed to expect. They were not prepared for Ilara, but Ilara was prepared for them. She stepped from the carriage without hesitation, without uncertainty, without even the smallest pause of adjustment. She did not look around. She did not hesitate. She entered, as if she had done so before. Her gaze moved through the hall with quiet precision, taking in details most would overlook. And then, without waiting to be addressed, she spoke. "Mrs. Gable." My head housekeeper straightened instantly, startled. Ilara did not ask. She did not confirm. She continued. "I trust my things were moved to the West Wing chambers." Not a question, a confirmation. Mrs. Gable blinked. "Your Grace, As requested," Ilara added softly. Silence, not confusion, recognition. That was when something shifted, because there had been no time for requests, no time for preparation, no time for messages to be sent ahead. And yet, everything was already in place. I did not interrupt. I did not question her. Not yet. Because the truth had already begun to take shape in my mind. And I needed to see how far it extended before I chose to expose it. So I watched her. Not as a husband, not as a man, but as one player recognizing another across the board. and beginning finally to understand. This was never her sister's story. It was hers. With the silver falcon pin cold in my palm, I sought out my new Duchess. I found her in the Blackwood Library, a room so vast it could swallow souls, yet she seemed perfectly at home. She was not reading, but studying a ledger, the accounts of the estate. I stood before her desk. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "I find myself concerned for your sister's welfare," I began, my voice deliberately neutral. "Such a sudden fever. One worries it might be contagious. Perhaps the Marquis of Vale should be warned. I hear he was a close acquaintance of Seraphina's." I watched for a flicker of fear, a telltale sign of guilt. I received nothing. Ilara simply closed the ledger. "The Marquis," she said, her voice like chilled glass, "is a man of fleeting interests. I am certain his attention has already moved on." She didn't deny the connection. She dismissed it. The coldness of her response was more damning than any confession. The true test came a week later, at our first formal dinner. The dining room was a sea of jewels and calculating eyes. The main course had just been cleared when the Dowager Duchess of Ainsworth, a woman whose tongue was sharper than a dueling sword, leaned forward. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying across the table, "we were all so distressed to hear of Lady Seraphina's indisposition. One hopes it is not a condition that runs in the family. So inconvenient to fall ill at such a crucial moment." The silence was a physical blow. It was a public accusation wrapped in silk. Lord Thorne, who was in attendance, turned a ghastly shade of white. All eyes fell on Ilara. I expected her to shrink, to stammer an excuse. Instead, she placed her fork down with quiet precision. She met the Dowager Duchess's cruel gaze. "Indeed, Your Grace, it is a sign of great family fortitude, I believe, to ensure that commitments are honored, no matter the personal cost. The Blackwood name is not one to be associated with broken promises." She had not defended herself or her sister. She had defended my name. She had turned an accusation against her family into a statement of my family's unshakable honor. The Dowager Duchess sat back, momentarily silenced, a rare feat. In that moment, I saw her not as a pawn, but as a formidable ally I had somehow acquired by accident. Later that night, I went to her chambers. The pretense was over. I opened my hand and placed the silver falcon pin on the table between us. "This was found in Seraphina's suite," I said quietly. "There was no illness, was there?" Ilara looked at the pin, then back at me. Her shoulders did not slump in defeat. "No," she said, her voice steady. "There was no illness. My sister chose to elope with the Marquis of Vale the night before our wedding." It was a confirmation, but not a surrender. The air crackled with the truth, but it felt incomplete. This was worse than I imagined. The Thornes hadn't just lied. They had covered up a ruinous, society-destroying scandal with another. "So you took her place," I said, the scale of her family's desperation hitting me. "To save your father from ruin." "I took her place to save our name from obliteration," she corrected me softly. Then she stood, walked to a locked jewelry box, and retrieved a small folded letter. She didn't hand it to me. She held it. "My father believes my sister ran away for love," she said, her eyes burning with an intensity I had never seen. "He is a fool. Seraphina was beautiful and charming, but she was also a target." She finally extended the letter to me. It was in Seraphina's frantic script, but it wasn't a love note. It was a desperate, terrified plea. "I cannot procure the sum you demand," it read. "My father's accounts are stretched to their limit. If you expose us, we are all ruined. Please, you must give me more time." The Marquis of Vale was not a suitor. He was a blackmailer. Seraphina hadn't eloped for love. She had run away in terror. And as I stood there, holding proof of a far darker secret, a chilling question solidified in my mind. How long had Ilara known? And if she knew her sister was being extorted, why did she let her run? The letter changed everything. This was no longer a matter of a foolish elopement, but of calculated cruelty and extortion. Blackwood had not been tied to a mere scandal, but to a crime. My honor, my family's legacy, demanded I seize control of the narrative. The days of quiet observation were over. Ilara and I were no longer just a duke and his unexpected duchess. We were allies, bound by a secret that could destroy us both. The Marquis of Vale must be dealt with, I stated, my voice cold, but not quietly. His ruin must be as public as the humiliation he intended for your sister. Ilara watched me, her gaze sharp and assessing. And my father? He will answer for his deception, I assured her. But first, we dismantled the predator. Our strategy began subtly. I arranged for my solicitor to discreetly purchase a significant portion of the Marquis of Vale's outstanding debts. It was a staggering sum, owed to tailors, jewelers, and moneylenders across the city, all men who were beginning to lose their patience. With a single stroke, I became his primary creditor, the invisible puppeteer holding his financial strings. He didn't know it yet, but his world was already mine to command. The next step was social. Ilara, once a wallflower, began to bloom under the Blackwood sun. At a musicale hosted by Lady Danbury, she engaged the formidable Minister of Finance in a debate over trade tariffs, displaying a grasp of economics that left him and everyone around them stunned. Whispers began to change. The Shadow Sister was now being called the Iron Duchess. She wasn't just my wife, she was an asset, and people were starting to see her strength as an extension of my own. I began to drop calculated remarks into conversations. To Lord Ashworth, I'd mention the unfortunate risks of rash investments. To another, I'd express my disdain for men who build their reputations on borrowed fortunes. I never named the Marquise, but the seeds of suspicion were planted. Society is a garden that loves to cultivate gossip, and I was giving them fertile soil. The tension began to coil at every social event. The Marquis of Vale, blissfully unaware, continued his charade, preening and charming his way through ballrooms. But now, when he entered a room, a hush would fall. Eyes would follow him. People knew something was amiss. They could feel the shift in the social currents, the silent gathering storm with the House of Blackwood at its center. Our final piece was Serafina. My agents located her, living in a squalid boarding house on the coast, abandoned and penniless. The Marquis had taken what little jewelry she had and vanished the moment he realized she had no access to the Thorn or Blackwood fortunes. I sent a carriage for her, not out of pity, but as a strategic necessity. She was the weapon we needed for the final act. When she arrived at Blackwood Manor, she was a ghost of her former self, thin, defeated, and stripped of her pride. Ilara met her in the grand hall. There were no tears, no recriminations. "You will be given a room, and you will be fed," Ilara said, her voice devoid of emotion. "And at the Duke's winter ball, you will tell everyone the truth, not my truth or father's, yours." Serafina looked at her sister, truly looked at her for the first time. The shock on her face was absolute. She had expected a rival. She had found a general. The stage was now set. The players were in position. The winter ball would not be a celebration. It would be an execution. The Blackwood ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles, a breathtaking spectacle of wealth and power. But beneath the symphony of strings and clinking crystal, a different kind of music was playing, the low hum of anticipation. Every guest knew this was not just a ball, it was a reckoning. The Marquis of Vale, arrogant and oblivious, made the first and final mistake of his life. He approached us, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Your Grace," he said, bowing shallowly. "And the Duchess, a surprising, yet I must say, resilient choice." The insult, a final public jab at Ilara being a substitute, hung in the air. I smiled, a cold, deliberate expression that did not reach my eyes. Resilience is a quality one appreciates, Marquis, especially when faced with crushing financial inconveniences. A few nearby guests fell silent, their eyes widening. The Marquise's smile faltered. That was my signal. I gave a slight nod to my steward. The orchestra faded into an abrupt, jarring silence. In an instant, every conversation in the vast ballroom ceased. 200 pairs of eyes turned to us. I raised my voice, clear and cutting. "My apologies for the interruption. It has come to my attention that a viper has been allowed into my home, a man who preys on the vulnerable and hides his cowardice behind a charming facade. The Marquis turned pale. He knew. A man, I continued, my voice echoing in the dead silence, who is so indebted to his tailors, his jewelers, and his moneylenders that he has resorted to blackmail. I paused, letting the word land like a physical blow, and as of this morning, as his sole remaining creditor, I am calling in every last one of his debts, immediately. A collective gasp swept the room. It was financial execution, delivered before the entire aristocracy. But I was not finished. At the far end of the ballroom, a door opened. Serafina stepped through. She was not dressed in a ball gown, but in a simple, modest dress. She was pale and thin, a ghost in her own story. She walked toward us, her eyes fixed on the Marquis. "He did not love me," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "He threatened to expose my father's debts if I did not pay him. When I had nothing left, he abandoned me." The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place for everyone to see. The scandal was complete. I turned my gaze to Lord Thorne, who was trembling by a pillar. "And you, Lord Thorne. You knew your daughter was being threatened, and you tried to solve it by sacrificing another at my altar." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of two reputations dying, the sound of social obliteration. The Marquis of Vale stood frozen, exposed. Lord Thorne looked as if he might collapse. I placed my hand on my wife's arm. Ilara stood beside me, poised and calm. Her expression was not one of triumph. It was one of order restored. The shadow had not just taken her sister's place. She had burned down the entire corrupt stage and built a throne from the ashes. The fallout was immediate and absolute. The Marquis of Vale fled the country by dawn, his name a permanent stain on the pages of society gossip. He was a ghost, remembered only as a fool who dared to challenge Blackwood, and lost. Lord Thorne retired to his crumbling country estate, a broken man who had gambled with his daughters and lost his name, his fortune, and his honor in a single night. Serafina was given a quiet dowry and sent to live with distant relatives in the north. She was granted a life of peaceful obscurity, a mercy she had never shown her sister. But the whispers about my wife changed entirely. Ilara was no longer the replacement, the second choice. They called her the Iron Duchess. Her counsel was sought, her opinions respected, and her presence at any gathering became a mark of its importance. She had not simply endured a scandal, she had wielded it like a weapon and reshaped her world with its power. One evening, I found her standing on the balcony, looking out over the moonlit gardens of the estate she now commanded. I stood beside her, no longer a man bound by a surprise contract, but a husband standing with his equal. I had been betrothed to the diamond of the season, a woman celebrated for her flawless, shining surface. But the woman I married was something far more rare. She was the mind that saw every facet, every flaw, and knew the precise pressure needed to reveal the stone's true strength. Society believed they were witnessing a substitution at the altar that day. They were, in fact, witnessing a coronation.